The insult didn't wait for the will to be opened. It came first clean, deliberate, and loud enough to bruise. Before the lawyer even touched the folder, my older brother leaned forward and said it plainly, as if he were stating a fact everyone already knew. I was here for formality, not inheritance. His wife didn't look at me when she spoke. She smiled at the table instead, the polished wood reflecting her certainty, and added that our father had corrected his last mistake. Me. They said it without anger. That was the worst part. As if erasing me from my father's life and his fortune was a practical decision. Necessary. Long overdue. I felt the room tilt. 31 years of being someone's son reduced to a footnote before a legal proceeding. I was still breathing, still sitting in the chair, but in their version of the story, I was already gone. What they didn't know was that my father had changed something near the end, and one line, just one, was about to decide whether I disappeared or finally existed. Before I tell you who was standing there and what happened next, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story resonates with you. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I truly enjoy connecting with you. Now let me take you back to where everything began. I arrived at the law office alone. That detail stayed with me longer than I expected. Not because I didn't have people in my life, but because the building itself seemed designed to amplify isolation. The lobby was quiet in the way only professional spaces are. No music, no small talk, just the soft echo of footsteps against marble floors and the faint smell of old paper and furniture polish. The receptionist barely looked up when I gave my name. She pointed me toward a hallway lined with framed certifications and plaques, each one a reminder that this place dealt in permanence. By the time I reached the conference room, my brother and his wife were already inside. Derek sat at the head of the table like it belonged to him. Not formally, his name wasn't on the lease. His title wasn't printed anywhere, but his posture said everything. Back straight, shoulders relaxed, hands folded with practiced patience. He looked like someone waiting for a process to confirm what he already believed was his. Sienna sat beside him, legs crossed, one hand resting lightly on his arm. The gesture wasn't affectionate. It was possessive, as if she were anchoring him in place. They stopped talking when I entered. Not abruptly, just enough to make it clear the conversation wasn't meant for me. Caleb, Derek said, nodding once. No smile, no warmth. The kind of greeting you give a former employee, not a brother. Sienna glanced at me briefly, then returned her attention to her phone. The screen reflected faintly in her eyes as she scrolled, calm and unbothered. Whatever this meeting was going to decide, she had already made peace with the outcome. I chose the chair farthest from them. The leather was stiff, the armrests cold against my palms. I sat there with my hands folded, mirroring Derek without meaning to. Somewhere in my chest, my heart was working harder than it should have been. But I kept my breathing steady. I told myself I was here to listen. Nothing more. Whatever happened in this room had already been decided months ago, maybe years. That thought brought my father into focus. The last time I had seen him alive, he'd looked smaller than I remembered. Not weaker, just quieter. The kind of man who had already said most of what he needed to say and was content to let silence carry the rest. We talked about practical things, weather, a property deal he was finalizing. He asked about my work, listened closely, nodded in a way that suggested he was filing the information away for later. He didn't mention Derek, or Sienna, or the future. At the time, I'd assumed that meant distance. Now, sitting in that chair, I wondered if it had meant something else entirely. The door opened, and the lawyer entered with a thin folder tucked under his arm. He was older than I expected, gray at the temples, glasses perched low on his nose, movements careful but confident. This was not his first reading, and it showed. He greeted everyone politely, his tone neutral as if personal history had no place in the room. That alone felt like a relief. As he took his seat, I noticed my Uncle Paul slip in behind him. Paul didn't say anything at first. He simply met my eyes and gave a small nod. It wasn't reassurance. It was acknowledgement. The kind that says, "I see what this is costing you, even if I can't stop it." Derek shifted in his chair. Impatience barely concealed, Sienna straightened, setting her phone face down on the table like a final decision. The lawyer opened the folder. The sound of paper sliding against paper was soft, but in that moment it felt louder than anything else in the room. I sat up a little straighter. Whatever my brother thought he had already won, whatever version of me he and his wife had agreed to erase, this was the moment it would be written down. I arrived at the law office alone. That detail stayed with me longer than I expected. Not because I didn't have people in my life, but because the building itself seemed designed to amplify isolation. The lobby was quiet, in the way only professional spaces are. No music, no small talk, just the soft echo of footsteps against marble floors and the faint smell of old paper and furniture polish. The receptionist barely looked up when I gave my name. She pointed me toward a hallway lined with framed certifications and plaques, each one a reminder that this place dealt in permanence. By the time I reached the conference room, my brother and his wife were already inside. Derek sat at the head of the table like it belonged to him. Not formally, his name wasn't on the lease. His title wasn't printed anywhere, but his posture said everything. Back straight, shoulders relaxed, hands folded with practiced patience. He looked like someone waiting for a process to confirm what he already believed was his. Sienna sat beside him, legs crossed, one hand resting lightly on his arm. The gesture wasn't affectionate. It was possessive, as if she were anchoring him in place. They stopped talking when I entered. Not abruptly, just enough to make it clear the conversation wasn't meant for me. Caleb, Derek said, nodding once. No smile, no warmth. The kind of greeting you give a former employee, not a brother. Sienna glanced at me briefly, then returned her attention to her phone. The screen reflected faintly in her eyes as she scrolled calm and unbothered. Whatever this meeting was going to decide, she had already made peace with the outcome. I chose the chair farthest from them. The leather was stiff, the armrests cold against my palms. I sat there with my hands folded, mirroring Derek without meaning to. Somewhere in my chest, my heart was working harder than it should have been. But I kept my breathing steady. I told myself I was here to listen. Nothing more. Whatever happened in this room had already been decided months ago, maybe years. That thought brought my father into focus. The last time I had seen him alive, he'd looked smaller than I remembered. Not weaker, just quieter. The kind of man who had already said most of what he needed to say and was content to let silence carry the rest. We talked about practical things, weather, a property deal he was finalizing. He asked about my work, listened closely, nodded in a way that suggested he was filing the information away for later. He didn't mention Derek, or Sienna, or the future. At the time, I'd assumed that meant distance. Now, sitting in that chair, I wondered if it had meant something else entirely. The door opened, and the lawyer entered with a thin folder tucked under his arm. He was older than I expected. Gray at the temples, glasses perched low on his nose movements, careful but confident. This was not his first reading, and it showed. He greeted everyone politely, his tone neutral as if personal history had no place in the room. That alone felt like a relief. As he took his seat, I noticed my Uncle Paul slip in behind him. Paul didn't say anything at first. He simply met my eyes and gave a small nod. It wasn't reassurance. It was acknowledgement. The kind that says, "I see what this is costing you, even if I can't stop it." Derek shifted in his chair, impatience barely concealed. Sienna straightened, setting her phone face down on the table like a final decision. The lawyer opened the folder. The sound of paper sliding against paper was soft, but in that moment it felt louder than anything else in the room. I sat up a little straighter. Whatever my brother thought he had already won, whatever version of me he and his wife had agreed to erase, this was the moment it would be written down. While the lawyer organized the papers, my mind slipped backward back to the years when the distance between my brother and me first became something solid. Derek had always been louder, older by 7 years, confident in a way that filled rooms without effort. When our father talked about the company, Derek listened like a man already preparing to inherit it. I listened like someone trying to understand the weight of it. That difference mattered more than either of us realized at the time. I joined the family business straight out of college. I didn't want a title. I wanted proximity to my father, to the work he had built from nothing. At first it felt right. Long days, early mornings, the quiet satisfaction of seeing how deals were structured and how decisions rippled outward. My father watched me closely, correcting without humiliating, teaching without softness. When I got something wrong, he didn't raise his voice. He just asked me why I thought it was right. Derek didn't like that. By the time Sienna entered the picture, the tension had already found its rhythm. She came in sharp and observant, quick to learn names, quicker to understand influence. Where Derek led with authority, she led with control. She noticed everything: who spoke last in meetings, who deferred, who waited for approval. And she noticed me. At first it was subtle. Comments about my workload, jokes about my sensitivity, suggestions that I wasn't built for pressure. She said these things with a smile, always within earshot of others, never directly to my father. Derek never contradicted her. He didn't need to. Silence did the work for him. The story they told about me began to spread quietly. Caleb didn't want responsibility. Caleb was unreliable. Caleb couldn't handle the weight of real leadership. I tried to fight it the wrong way by working harder, staying later, taking on more than I should have. But the more I pushed, the more obvious it became that I was never meant to win that game. The narrative had already been written. The breaking point came when I was 26. There was a meeting I wasn't invited to. A decision that affected my department, but somehow passed without my input. When I asked about it, Derek told me it was handled. When I pressed, Sienna smiled and said, "We didn't want to overwhelm you." That was the first time I realized I was being managed out of my own family. I left not long after. Quietly. No dramatic confrontation. I told my father I needed to find my own footing. He didn't argue. He didn't stop me either. He looked at me for a long moment and said only, "Make sure you learn something wherever you go." At the time, that felt like dismissal. Sitting in the law office now, I wondered if it had been trust instead. Across the table, Derek adjusted his cufflinks, a habit he picked up after his promotion to CEO. Sienna leaned toward him and whispered something I couldn't hear. They looked settled, certain. I felt the old doubt stir, the familiar question rising again. Had my father agreed with them in the end? Had he watched me leave and decided they were right? My hands tightened around each other beneath the table. I reminded myself that I hadn't come here to be defended or vindicated. I came because this was the last place my father's voice would exist in written form. If he had chosen to let me go, I would accept it. But I needed to hear it without interruption, without my brother translating it into something smaller. The lawyer cleared his throat. The past receded just enough for the present to take hold again. The lawyer began with language that felt deliberately distant, the kind designed to remove emotion from the room. Dates, legal phrasing, confirmation of identity. Each sentence landed with careful neutrality, as if the paper itself were trying not to take sides. I listened, but my attention drifted again. This time not to my brother or his wife, but to my father as I remembered him outside the frame they liked to use. He was not a sentimental man. He didn't talk about feelings unless there was a reason. What he believed in was structure, responsibility, consequences that followed choices without apology. When I was younger, I used to mistake that restraint for coldness. It wasn't until later that I realized how much discipline it took to love without making it easy. He used to wake me up before dawn when I visited on weekends. Not every time. Just enough that I learned not to complain when he did. We'd sit at the kitchen table while the house was still quiet, drinking coffee I didn't like yet, reviewing numbers from deals he was working on. He'd ask me what I thought, then wait. If my answer was shallow, he didn't correct me. He let the silence do it. That was how he taught. He never told me I would inherit anything, never promised a future he couldn't guarantee. What he did say once when I was struggling to keep up with Derek's pace stayed with me longer than most things. Power is loud, he said. Control is quiet. Don't confuse the two. At the time, I didn't know which one he thought I lacked. The lawyer moved on to preliminary allocations, small donations, personal effects, items of symbolic value. Derek leaned back in his chair as if this were all a formality, his gaze drifting toward the window. Sienna's expression remained composed, but her fingers tapped lightly against the table. A rhythm, measured, expectant. When the first significant asset was assigned to Derek temporary management authority over several holding companies, he nodded once satisfied. Sienna's tapping stopped. She glanced at me just long enough to confirm what she believed I was feeling. Defeat. I kept my eyes on the table. Inside, something tightened, not anger, not yet. Just the familiar sensation of being evaluated and found wanting. The same feeling I'd had years ago when decisions were made without me, when my absence became convenient. My Uncle Paul shifted in his chair beside me. I could feel the movement more than I saw it. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence was steady, unreactive. It occurred to me then that he was listening differently than the rest of us, not for affirmation, for precision. The lawyer paused briefly, adjusting his glasses. "There is an important clarification," he said, his voice unchanged. Sienna straightened. Derek leaned forward, slightly interest sharpening his features. The clarification had to do with timing, with revisions made late, with the fact that my father had insisted on independent review, another detail that felt distinctly like him, methodical, protective in ways that didn't announce themselves. My pulse picked up. The lawyer emphasized that while operational control had been assigned, ownership had not yet been addressed. The distinction hung in the air longer than the sentence itself. Derek's confidence flickered, not enough to alarm him, but enough to register. Sienna's gaze hardened. I realized then that whatever my father had written, it wasn't simple. He hadn't chosen a side and walked away. He had constructed something, a structure that required patience to understand. And patience had never been my brother's strength. For the first time since I entered the room, I felt something shift, not in my favor, not yet, but away from certainty. The kind of shift that introduces risk. I sat a little straighter. If this was going to be a test, then maybe it wasn't meant to break me. The lawyer continued reading, his voice, steady, unhurried, as if time itself had slowed to accommodate the weight of the document. More assets were named. Accounts, trusts, interim authorities. Each one landed like a small confirmation of what Derek and Sienna had expected all along. Derek didn't smile. He didn't need to. His satisfaction showed in the way he stopped listening carefully, the way his shoulders loosened as if the outcome were already settled. Sienna, on the other hand, listened to every word with surgical focus. Her attention sharpened whenever a clause brushed close to permanence and relaxed when it didn't. That alone told me something. She wasn't celebrating yet. She was counting. When the lawyer announced that Derek would retain executive control of the primary operating entities for the immediate future, Sienna finally leaned back. Her lips curved not into a grin, but into something quieter, more dangerous. She turned her head slightly toward me and spoke just low enough that only I could hear. "You see," she said, "this is what responsibility looks like." I didn't respond. Not because I didn't want to, but because I knew any reaction would only give her what she wanted. Validation. Proof that her words still carried weight. Inside, though, the old doubt pressed harder. Had my father really entrusted everything to them? Had he decided that control mattered more than blood? The lawyer moved on, outlining limitations, safeguards, review periods. The language grew more technical, less emotional. Derek's attention drifted again. He had heard enough to believe the ending was inevitable. Sienna, however, leaned forward once more when the lawyer mentioned oversight and conditions tied to conduct. Her fingers stopped tapping. There it was. The first visible crack. She interrupted before I could stop myself from noticing. "Just to be clear," she said, her tone polite but firm. "These provisions don't restrict long-term ownership, correct?" The lawyer didn't look up right away. He finished the sentence he was on, then adjusted the page with deliberate care. "Ownership is addressed later," he said. "In full." The room seemed to inhale. Derek shot her a quick look, irritation flashing across his face. He didn't like interruptions, especially not ones that suggested uncertainty. Sienna held his gaze for a second too long, then looked away, smoothing the front of her jacket as if recalibrating. I felt my pulse in my throat. For the first time, I considered the possibility that my father hadn't chosen the obvious path, that he hadn't rewarded volume or control, that maybe, just maybe, he had designed this moment to unfold exactly like this. The lawyer resumed. More assets, more temporary authorities, more language that sounded impressive without being absolute. Derek nodded along again, reassured by momentum. Sienna watched the lawyer's hands, instead of his face tracking how many pages remained in the folder. I followed her gaze. There were more than a few. My Uncle Paul shifted again this time, leaning back, his arms crossing loosely over his chest. The gesture wasn't defensive, it was patient, like someone waiting for a point to be proven. I wondered how long he'd known. When the lawyer paused to take a sip of water, Sienna leaned toward Derek and whispered something sharp enough to tighten his jaw. He responded under his breath, annoyance barely contained. Their confidence was no longer aligned. Whatever they had rehearsed on the way here was beginning to fray. I sat very still. If this was going to collapse, it would do so under its own weight. My father wouldn't have wanted theatrics. He would have wanted exposure. The lawyer placed his glass down and looked up. "We will now move to the provisions concerning permanent allocation," he said. And just like that, the room changed. The word permanent settled into the room with a different kind of weight. Derek straightened immediately. Whatever impatience he'd been carrying vanished, replaced by something sharper, anticipation edged with entitlement. Sienna adjusted in her seat, smoothing her skirt, preparing herself for confirmation. They both believed this was the moment the process would stop circling and finally land where it was supposed to. I didn't move. I wasn't afraid of the word anymore. I was afraid of what it would reveal. The lawyer flipped to a new section, the paper making a soft, deliberate sound. He didn't rush. He never rushed. That too felt intentional. My father had always hated haste, said it made people careless. These provisions, the lawyer began, reflect Mr. Morrison's final revisions executed 90 days prior to his passing. 90 days. Sienna's head lifted slightly, just enough for me to notice. Derek's jaw tightened, the muscle working beneath his skin. They both knew the date. Everyone in the room did. That was when my father had been hospitalized. When things had turned serious. When decisions stopped being theoretical. The lawyer continued outlining the structure of a trust that would temporarily hold controlling interests in several major assets. Management authority, he explained, would remain conditional, reviewed annually, contingent on performance, conduct, and adherence to specific ethical benchmarks my father had insisted on including. Ethical benchmarks. Derek let out a short, almost imperceptible breath through his nose. Sienna's fingers resumed their tapping, faster now, less controlled. "This is standard," she said, her voice smooth but tight. "My husband has been running the company for years." The lawyer looked at her for the first time since the reading began. Not confrontational, just attentive. And the trust acknowledges that, he said. Which is why the structure exists. To preserve continuity without granting irrevocable authority prematurely. Prematurely. The word hung there, uninvited. Derek leaned forward. "Are you suggesting my father didn't trust me?" It wasn't a question. It was a challenge. The lawyer met his gaze calmly. "I am suggesting your father trusted processes more than people." I felt something in my chest loosen at that. Not relief, recognition. Sienna interjected quickly. "Then where does that leave Caleb?" She said my name like it was an inconvenience that had somehow survived the draft. "Surely this doesn't mean—" "Please," the lawyer said gently, raising a hand. "We will get there." Her mouth pressed into a thin line. She sat back, crossing her arms now instead of her legs. Defensive. Contained. The lawyer continued reading, detailing oversight committees, independent audits, mechanisms that ensured no single person could quietly consolidate power. My father's fingerprints were all over it. The caution, the insistence on accountability, the refusal to let charisma substitute for integrity. As each clause was read, Derek's certainty eroded, not dramatically, not all at once, just enough to make him listen again. Sienna, meanwhile, stopped pretending this was a formality. Her eyes flicked from page to page, calculating, searching for reassurance that never quite came. I remained silent, not because I had nothing to say, but because I finally understood that this wasn't about defending myself. My father hadn't designed this to restore my pride. He'd designed it to reveal character under pressure, and the pressure was working. When the lawyer reached the end of the section, he paused, allowing the silence to stretch. Derek shifted uncomfortably. Sienna opened her mouth, then closed it again. My Uncle Paul leaned forward for the first time, resting his forearms on the table. Michael always said he spoke calmly, that power should make people steadier, not louder. No one responded. The lawyer turned the page. "We will now address the matter of final ownership," he said. My heart began to pound, not from hope, but from the sudden clarity that whatever came next would change more than numbers. It would settle the question my father had never answered out loud. The lawyer didn't read the next line right away. He scanned the page once more, as if confirming something for himself, then lifted his eyes, not to Derek, not to Sienna, but briefly, unmistakably, to me. It was a small gesture, almost accidental, but it was enough to make Sienna notice. Her posture changed instantly. "Why are you looking at him?" she asked the Polish in her voice beginning to thin. "If this is about ownership, we should be very clear about Mrs. Morrison," the lawyer said evenly. "This section requires context." Derek frowned. "Context for what?" "For intention," the lawyer replied. "Your father was very specific." I felt my throat tighten. Not because I expected good news, but because the room was no longer moving in a straight line. It was circling something. Something Derek and Sienna hadn't planned for. The lawyer began to read again, this time slower. He explained that while management authority had been provisionally granted, ownership was not determined by tenure or marital status. Instead, my father had outlined a distinction between stewardship and inheritance, between those who operated his legacy and the one he trusted to ultimately carry it. Sienna let out a sharp breath. "That's vague," she said. "Who exactly does that refer to?" The lawyer turned another page. "It refers to the beneficiary named in the final clause," he said. Derek's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "And who is that?" Silence stretched. I became acutely aware of my own breathing, of the way my hands were clenched together in my lap, of how quiet the room had become, as if the walls themselves were listening. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. "To my son Caleb Morrison," he read, "I leave full and permanent ownership of my estate, including all controlling interests, properties, and assets held at the time of my death." The words landed without force. No emphasis, no flourish. Just fact. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Sienna laughed. It was sharp and disbelieving, the kind of sound people make when reality briefly loses its shape. "That's not possible," she said, shaking her head. "There has to be a condition, some limitation." "There is none," the lawyer replied. Derek stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You expect us to believe he gave everything to him?" He gestured toward me, his voice rising. He walked away. He wasn't even there. "My Uncle Paul spoke before I could. He left because he wouldn't become what you needed him to be," he said quietly. "There's a difference." Sienna turned on him. "You knew about this." Paul didn't deny it. "I knew Michael was thinking carefully, that's all." The lawyer continued unshaken. "The estate will be transferred in full following standard probate procedures. Management authority will sunset accordingly." Sienna's composure cracked. Her face flushed, the controlled calm dissolving into something brittle. "This is manipulation," she said, pointing at me. "He played on guilt. He always did." I finally spoke. "He didn't need to," I said, my voice steady despite the noise in my chest. "He knew who I was." Derek stared at me like I was a stranger. Maybe I was. Not the version he'd been narrating for years. The lawyer closed the folder. "That concludes the reading," he said. The finality of it settled heavily. Not triumphant, not explosive, just done. I sat there, the weight of it pressing in, slowly realizing that my father hadn't chosen loudly. He hadn't defended me in rooms where I was spoken over. He had waited. And when it mattered, he had spoken once clearly enough to end the argument forever. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Derek remained standing, his hands planted on the table as if he needed the contact to stay upright. Sienna sank back into her chair, her confidence draining so quickly it felt physical. The version of the future they had rehearsed, control secured power, cemented me dismissed, had collapsed in a single paragraph. "This isn't over," Sienna said finally, though her voice no longer carried conviction. It sounded reflexive, something she had learned to say when things didn't go her way. "We can contest this. People do it all the time." The lawyer didn't even glance at the folder now. "You're entitled to pursue legal counsel," he said calmly. "But I should be clear. Your father anticipated that response. This will was reviewed by independent attorneys and revised under medical supervision. There are no procedural weaknesses." Derek turned toward me, his face tight with something I had never seen there before, fear disguised as anger. "You planned this," he said. "You stayed away so he'd feel guilty." I shook my head. "I stayed away because I didn't want to become someone I didn't recognize. That seemed to land harder than any accusation. His mouth opened, then closed again. For years, Derek had defined me as weak because I refused to fight the way he did. Now that refusal was written into the outcome. Sienna stood abruptly pacing a short line behind Derek's chair. "This isn't what he wanted," she said, more to herself than to anyone else. "He wanted stability, continuity. He wanted integrity," Paul said quietly. She spun toward him. "You always sided with him?" "No," Paul replied. "I sided with his values." The lawyer gathered the documents, stacking them with careful precision. "If there are no further questions," he said, "we'll begin the formal transition process." Questions. There were dozens burning in my chest, but none that needed answering out loud. Not here. Not now. I had come into this room expecting to leave smaller. Instead, I felt something unfamiliar space. Not excitement. Not triumph. Just the absence of a weight I'd been carrying for years without realizing it. Derek sank back into his chair. The posture that had once radiated certainty now looked forced defensive. He avoided my eyes. Sienna didn't. She looked at me with something close to disbelief. "Do you even know what this means?" she asked. "You think money makes you strong?" "No," I said. "I think trust does." She scoffed, but there was no bite left in it. Whatever authority she'd been wielding had evaporated. She had built her identity around proximity to power. And now that power had been reassigned, cleanly, irrevocably. I stood. The movement felt deliberate, not defiant. Just complete. "I'm not here to take anything from you," I said, addressing both of them. "I'm here because he left something to me. There's a difference." Derek looked up, then his eyes searching my face for the weakness he'd always counted on. He didn't find it. The lawyer opened the door, signaling the end of the meeting. As we filed out, Paul placed a hand on my shoulder. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His grip was firm grounding. Behind us, Derek and Sienna remained in the room, surrounded by the quiet they had mistaken for victory. In the hallway, the air felt different, lighter almost. Not because I'd won something, but because I was no longer arguing with a version of myself that never belonged to me. My father hadn't left me answers to every question, but he had left me enough to stop asking the wrong ones. We didn't speak as we walked out of the conference room. The hallway outside felt longer than it had when I arrived. The muted lighting and framed certificates passing by in slow succession. Each step carried a strange mix of weight and release. I wasn't rushing. There was no urgency now, no need to escape. What had happened inside that room was already sealed. Behind us, I could still hear Derek's voice, low-strained, asking the lawyer something I couldn't make out. Sienna's heels clicked sharply against the floor, pacing in short, agitated bursts. The sound followed us for a moment, then faded as the door closed. Paul and I reached the elevator and waited. When the doors slid shut, he finally spoke. "Your father never doubted you," he said. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a statement offered the way someone delivers a long overdue truth. I exhaled slowly, realizing I'd been holding my breath for most of the morning. "He never said it," I replied. Paul nodded. Michael believed that saying something and proving it weren't the same thing. He wanted his actions to do the talking. The elevator descended in silence. When it opened, we stepped out into the lobby where my mother was waiting near the windows. She looked up the moment she saw us, her expression guarded, braced for disappointment. I didn't need to speak. She crossed the space between us and pulled me into a hug that was both fierce and careful, as if she were afraid I might break. "He saw you," she said softly, her voice catching. "He always did." Outside, the air was cool and bright, the kind of day that doesn't match the gravity of what's just occurred. We stood there for a moment, none of us in a hurry to go anywhere. This wasn't an ending. It was a recalibration. Over the next few days, the shift became impossible to ignore. Calls I hadn't received in years started coming in. Distant relatives, old associates. People who had once dismissed me now spoke with sudden enthusiasm. Some offered congratulations. Others hinted at opportunities, partnerships, investments. Each conversation carried the same undertone proximity to what they believed I now represented. I listened politely, took notes, declined most of it. My father's voice echoed in my head. Wealth doesn't change people. It reveals them. Derek didn't call. Sienna tried once, left a message that oscillated between anger and negotiation. I didn't return it, not out of spite, but because there was nothing left to discuss. The legal reality had spoken. Anything beyond that would only reopen a dynamic I no longer needed to live inside. One evening, a week later, I drove out to the cemetery alone. The grounds were quiet, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the grass. I stood in front of my father's headstone and let the silence settle around me. There were things I wanted to say, questions I wished I'd asked while he was alive, but none of them felt urgent anymore. You trusted me, I said aloud, the words steady. I won't waste it. The promise wasn't about money or power. It was about carrying forward the part of him that believed restraint mattered more than dominance. That walking away could be an act of strength, not weakness. As I turned to leave, I felt something I hadn't expected. Closure. Not because everything had been resolved, but because the story I'd been telling myself for years about being forgotten, replaced irrelevant, had finally been proven false. The silence he left behind wasn't absence. It was intention. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that felt unfamiliar but steady. Paperwork arrived in waves, documents, confirmations, timelines. I met with attorneys who spoke carefully, as if afraid to disturb something fragile. They explained responsibilities, transitions, safeguards my father had put in place. Every decision seemed to echo his voice, not instructing, but guiding. He hadn't handed me a throne. He'd handed me a structure and expected me to stand inside it on my own. I moved slowly, intentionally. The company's offices felt different when I walked through them again. Not hostile, not welcoming either, just observant. People watched me the way they watch a weather change, uncertain whether it would pass or stay. I didn't correct anyone's assumptions. I listened, asked questions, took notes. Authority, I learned quickly, didn't need to announce itself. It showed up in follow-through. Derek resigned within the month. The announcement came through formal channels, carefully worded. He cited personal reasons and the need for distance. I didn't respond publicly. There was nothing to gain from victory laps. Sienna disappeared from view entirely. I heard through a third party that she had insisted on a private settlement discussion that never materialized. The allowance remained. The power did not return. At home, the quiet was deeper than I expected. There were nights I sat alone, the house lit softly, documents spread across the table, and felt the weight of it press in again, not as fear, but as responsibility. $40 million looked very different when it wasn't abstract. When it meant payrolls, livelihoods, decisions that would ripple outward in ways I couldn't always predict. That was when my father's lessons made the most sense. He hadn't believed in certainty. He believed in preparedness, in surrounding power with friction so it couldn't run wild, in choosing people not because they wanted control, but because they respected it. I visited my mother often. We talked about ordinary things, food, weather, old stories that had nothing to do with money or inheritance. One evening, as we sat on her porch, watching the sun drop behind the trees, she said something that stayed with me. "He didn't leave you wealth," she said. "He left you permission. Permission to stop shrinking. Permission to stop defending choices that didn't need justification. Permission to stand without waiting for approval." I thought back to the version of myself who had walked into that law office expecting erasure. The man who had learned to disappear to survive. That instinct didn't vanish overnight, but it loosened its grip. The world didn't change because I inherited something. I did. Not in dramatic ways, not all at once, but quietly the way real shifts happen. I stopped measuring myself against people who needed me small, stopped explaining my restraint as weakness, stopped mistaking silence for absence. My father had trusted me to learn that on my own. And now when I look back at that room, the polished table, the practiced certainty, the insult delivered like a verdict, I don't feel anger anymore. I feel clarity. Because in the end, the line that mattered most wasn't about money. It was the one that proved I had never been forgotten at all. For a long time, I thought strength looked like being chosen loudly. I thought it meant being defended in rooms where I wasn't present, having someone raise their voice on my behalf, or being handed certainty before I ever asked for it. When that didn't happen, I learned to disappear instead. I mistook silence for rejection, distance for indifference. I carried that misunderstanding into adulthood and let it shape how small I believed I was allowed to be. What I learned slowly and far too late to make it painless is that belief doesn't always arrive with reassurance. Sometimes it shows up as space, as trust, as the absence of interference. My father didn't remove obstacles for me. He watched to see whether I could stand without leaning on him, whether I would choose integrity over comfort, even when no one was watching. That kind of belief is easy to miss. It doesn't protect you from hurt in the moment. It doesn't stop people from rewriting your story while you're still in it. But it leaves you something quieter and more durable in the end, the knowledge that you were trusted to become yourself. We all carry moments where we feel erased by family, by circumstance, by the stories others tell about us. It's tempting to fight those moments by shouting back, by demanding to be seen. But sometimes, the truest answer isn't louder. It's steadier. It's choosing not to contort yourself into someone else's version of worthy. What I carry forward now isn't the weight of what I was given. It's the clarity of who I never stopped being.